again, for those of you who are joining, since you are not President Circle members, you are only participating in the second half, which is the last 45 minutes. We had a very good discussion in the first 45 minutes. So that's one way to encourage every one of you to join the Asia Society as a PC member, President Circle member. Anyway, with that, I welcome again the three speakers, Dr. Nimrod Garan, Dr. Ali Podeh, and then Dr. Moran Zaga. So with that, I will turn over to the three of them. Each of them will have 5 minutes to make some opening remarks. You can say whatever is on your mind or to continue from our last segment, and each of you will have 5 minutes, okay? Who will begin? Nimrod?
Yeah, thank you. And again, it's a big pleasure to be here with all of you, and I welcome the new people joining us. I would like to speak on Israel-Turkey relations in this part of the conversation. I think as Israel is now improving different bilateral relationship it has within the Middle East and the Mediterranean, a special place could be looked at concerning Turkey, because Israel and Turkey are two important countries in the region.
Recording in progress.
Continuous diplomatic relations since 1949. So while the relationship between Israel and Turkey had lots of ups and downs, a lot of time when it was a more secret relationship, more strategic oriented, not a lot in the public eye, relationship was undergoing or ongoing, and it became very resilient to political challenges. The relationship has been downgraded several times in history, and especially over the last decade or so, it was mostly characterized by political or diplomatic tensions. You may remember that around the 2008-2009 war in Gaza, tensions between the two countries flared up, leading to another crisis with the flotilla incident, bringing aid to Gaza. And then only in 2016 did both countries manage to reconcile, signing an agreement that did not last for too long. It took only 2 years from 2016 to 2018 for the relationship to break down again. So currently, both in Israel and in Turkey, there are embassies in place, but there are no acting ambassadors. Relationship is ongoing in terms of trade and tourism, but the narrative was one of tensions, of one of negative rhetoric. About a year and a half ago, it began to change, and we began to see Turkish signals of an interest to somehow improve the relationship. It was more or less in line with similar overtures that Turkey did towards other countries, and we see recently Turkish attempts to improve relations with the UAE, with the Saudis, with the Egyptians, with the Armenians even. There was a period of time in which it happened with Greece. Now it's not going that well anymore. But Turkish foreign policy was beginning to try and mend some of the problematic ties that it had in the region. And Israel was definitely one of those. In Israel, it was responded with quite a bit of skepticism, both under Netanyahu and in the early days of the current government. There is a lack of trust in Erdogan. There is a lesson learned from 2016 that an agreement that is being signed and for which Israel is paying a price may not last once another escalation with the Palestinians is happening. So the process is a very gradual one. And since the election of President Yitzhak Herzog in June of last year, more or less the same time the new government was put in place, we see a gradual process in which Israel and Turkey are trying to rebuild the trust between them. They are opening up new channels of communication between senior officials, expanding existing channels and opening up new ones. They are re-energizing previous fields in which they cooperated in the past, and they are seeking for new narratives, new fields to cooperate in the future. Just recently, there were security threats on Israelis visiting Istanbul by Iranian forces or actors. The Israeli and Turkish security authorities cooperated very well to handle that, and that in a way reshaped Israeli perceptions about Turkey, not anymore as a major rival country, but as a partner, a country that is willing to pitch in and help secure the lives of Israelis visiting it. The two countries are also looking to cooperate on economic issues. Just today, it was announced that the Economic and Trade Office of Israel and Turkey will be reopened. The countries are engaging in negotiation on civic aviation, on enabling more flights to happen, more Israeli carriers to go to Turkey. They are talking about energy cooperation, mostly about renewables, but not only that. We are talking about perhaps trilaterals. The Turkey that is now in better relationship with the UAE could have joint projects with Israel and the UAE together on economic issues. So the sides are looking for tangible benefits from this relationship, and by promoting those, the trust is being built. And now I think both countries are more or less ready to go to the final step of the process they've been undergoing over the last year and reinstall relationship at the ambassadorial level. An important point in that, which was mentioned in the previous visit to Israel and to Turkey by the officials, was to also launch a mechanism that will enable the countries to moderate tensions between them once there will be something negative happening on the Palestinian track, as to prevent that this relationship will collapse once again. There is a lot of potential in this relationship. It's not only about governments, it's also about the business people, the civil society. There's a lot of connections that are going on. So there's a lot of things, positive things happening, which coincide with other positive things happening in Israel's relations in the region, which Eli and Moran will probably speak about. Thank you.
Very good. It's a good historic perspective of Israel's relationship with Turkey and indeed Turkey's foreign relationship in the region. Later, I hope you will also address the East Mediterranean pipeline. Is it on? Is it not on? Turkey has reason now to want it. So anyway, but Ali, say whatever you want to say, or if you like, you can also address the East Mediterranean pipeline issue.
Okay. Thank you very much. And again, it's an honor and pleasure to be here. In the first part, I concentrated mainly on the Israeli-Saudi relations as a result of the forthcoming Biden visit to both Israel and Saudi Arabia. Now, here in this part, let me do two things. First of all, to talk a little bit deeper about Israel's relations with some of the Arab countries. And secondly, to say something about the question of normalization. And whatever I'm saying is largely based on a book that I just finished about Israel's secret relations in the Middle East from 1948 until today. It came out in Hebrew, but hopefully soon it will come out in English as well. Now, when we saw the Abraham Accord, we have to understand that that was a culmination of a long process. It didn't happen suddenly. And the culmination of a long process, if we take, for example, Morocco, then we are talking about relations that started already something certainly in the 60s, perhaps maybe in the 50s. And we are talking about secret relations that went through the intelligence, mainly the Mossad connection, and also foreign affairs relations. I mean, for example, a very important meeting took place in Morocco as a preparation for Sadat's visit in Jerusalem in 1977. So we're talking about a solid foundation that led to the Abraham Accord between Israel and Morocco. The Emirate. The Emirate, it started also almost 30 years ago after the Oslo agreements, when the Emirati approached Prime Minister Rabin, and they asked for the Israeli approval for Americans selling them the F-16, and Rabin agreed. So that sounds quite familiar with the F-35 issue, but we are talking about something that happened a long time ago. And since then, behind the scenes, there were extensive relations between the two countries on different spheres, in trade, in diplomacy, and so on. Bahrain, the same story from the post-Oslo period. And with Sudan is a particular different case because with Sudan, we had intermittent relations, ups and downs, but that started somewhere in the 50s and the 60s. And so therefore, whenever we see something openly, we have to think that something was happening behind the scenes for a long period of time. And even Saudi Arabia is a good example, because with the Saudis, Israel had connection from at least the last 2 decades, since the Second Lebanese War in 2006, when the interest of the two sides, they merged against Iran, Hezbollah, and other Iranian proxies. But in my research, I found that the connection between Israelis and the Saudis was already in the 70s. And the Saudis sent emissaries to the Israeli government. Israel was not enthusiastic, but nevertheless, it did happen. And the Saudis came out with 2 peace proposals in the 80s and one in the year 2002. So we are talking again about something solid that happened mainly behind the scenes. And what we are witnessing today, the kind of normalization, is the culmination of all those things. Now, a word of caution about normalization. Normalization has different phases. It's not only one thing, we have to understand. Now, if we go to Israeli-Arab relations, we have three types. The first type of normalization is the one that's happening just behind the scenes. And that's what just I mentioned between Israel and the different Arab countries. The second one is the formal one, which is being held between Israel and Egypt, Israel and Jordan, and that's mainly between the governments. It's not between the people. Civil society, to a large extent, ignores or fight against struggles, mainly the trade union. They voice their opposition all the time. And the third type is the legitimate or the full or the warm normalization. And that's exactly the Abraham Accord, not with Sudan, but with Morocco, with the Emirates and Bahrain. And with those countries, we have full normalization, which means not only between government, but also between the people. And obviously, this is the kind of normalization that we would like to see with other Arab countries. But for the time being, let's look at it as a process. I mean, it started a long time ago, and it's moving ahead, and we are somewhere in the middle. And now the main issue is what will happen between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Thank you.
Thank you. Moran, you mentioned in the first segment about, economic really being very important in the relationship between Israel and its now neighbors. Let me tell you that one of the gentlemen who may be watching us in YouTube or whatever right now is a friend of mine from Israel. He used to invest only between Israel and US. He even moved his family to US because of necessity for the business. He sent me a note yesterday and said that he is now very active in UAE, in your neighborhood again. So I suppose it goes to your point earlier, Moran, about the primacy of the business side of things. So why don't you tell us about give us your 5-minute opening remark first, and then we'll go into the discussion.
Thank you, and thank you again for having me. I want to continue on your point and Professor Podet's point, the historical description to a more contemporary view. And as Professor Podet mentioned in detail, security relations between Israel and the Gulf existed much before the Abraham Accords. As you say, there were varied economic ties and also economic ties under the table. So what were the Abraham Accords about? This is one-on-one raised today, and there are various assumptions about the reasons for the Abraham Accords. Many people believe, for example, that Iran was and still is the glue for Israel's relations with the Arab Gulf countries, and I want to discuss this assumption. A year before the Abraham Accords were signed, Abu Dhabi started negotiations with Tehran regarding maritime pacification in the Gulf. And now, at that time, the UAE was involved in the war in Yemen, and on other fronts, such as Libya and Afghanistan. And since the summer of 2019, the UAE made a huge shift from a hard power player, adversarial player, to a country that offers soft diplomacy and reconciliations. Now, the Abraham Accords continue that trend of soft diplomacy, pacifying diplomacy. Half a year later, the UAE normalized its relations with Qatar and later with Turkey. Now, during that period of time, Saudi Arabia also started negotiations with Tehran. The Saudis were more adversarial to Iran than the Emiratis. And with their reconciliations, a new era in the Gulf began. Now, we used to think in terms of friends and foes axis in the Middle East. Some would say the Islamic axis versus the moderate Sunni states axis, but this, I think, does not exist anymore, at least not as it used to be. The realpolitik transcended the ideological differences. Now, this is true also for the approach, the regional approach for the Russia-Ukraine war. Realpolitik also in this case is more significant than the role of ideology when countries in the region, by the way, also Israel and the UAE in their approach to this war. Now, when looking at the Abraham Accords from this perspective, we understand that one, they obviously had a practical nature, less ideological. And second, they serve as a balancing element in this now complex network of multiple alliances. It's not Iran alone that was the trigger for the Abraham Accords, from my perspective, rather than the redefinition of the national strategy of the United Arab Emirates. The UAE wanted to have more options, in its foreign affairs. And by adding Israel to its network as another ally, it expanded its maneuver abilities. For Israel, of course, the Abraham Accords meant greater connectivity with the region and greater legitimacy with or without Iran. So more than the economics, as you asked, and more than security, I think that the deeper strategic reasoning had a decisive role in the development and the continuation of the Abraham Accords.
Thank you. Let me go back to the topic that Nimrod started in this segment, and that is Turkey. Turkey is moving far more, becoming even more religious, reversing a lot of the things that their founding father Ataturk has put in place. A lot of the cathedrals are now turned back to mosques, for example, including the biggest of them all in Istanbul. So how will the religiosity or increasing religiosity of Turkey affect its longer-term relationship with Israel? Do you worry about that? Or is geopolitics or geoeconomics so powerful that will breathe sense into people who are otherwise becoming more and more religious? Nimrod?
No, we have quite a history already with Erdogan in power in Turkey, and we can compare what happened in different points of time during his 20 or so years in power. Of course, Turkey is becoming not necessarily a religious, but a more observant society, and it impacts the conservative nature of what is happening there in the place of previous leaders in Turkish history. But we see that even within the scope of AKP control in Turkey, there have been times in which Israel-Turkey relations were not as bad. The first few years, people do not tend to remember that Erdogan was visiting Jerusalem. He went to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial. He met with Ariel Sharon, the prime minister at the time. It was along the time in which Israel made some positive moves on the Palestinian issue. It was around the disengagement from Gaza. So it's not only about domestic politics, it's about overall interest, and we see that in play, especially now. We saw how previous incidents of tensions around Jerusalem and Al-Aqsa Mosque, Gaza, sparked a very negative reaction from Turkey. And this time around, during the last month of Ramadan, in which there was tensions in Jerusalem, in which there was terror attacks that Israel responded harshly to, still the Turkish reaction was much more moderate, partly because things were in a different context, in a context in which the countries want to move forward in this relationship. So yes, each country is caring about what happened in the others. We would like to see democracy flourishing in the region around us. But eventually, foreign policy is about the interest and the ability of countries to work together despite the internal hardship that each of them is facing.
By the way, Nimrod, you guys are the only one who talk about democracy in your part of the world. I go to Turkey a lot. I go to UAE a lot, and Saudi Arabia periodically, and Israel. You guys are the only one who talks about democracy. It doesn't seem to bother people too much. I suppose that's just a fact that you have to accept. If that's the way they have been for thousands of years, that's the way they will be most likely today. But Ali, let me ask you a question about the East Mediterranean pipeline. Turkey liked your energy. Now you have a lot of energy. They like the pipeline to go through them rather than bypass them. America doesn't like it. But now with Ukraine war, you think that it will change? Because after all, the EU already signed a deal with Israel and Egypt on supplying of natural gas just a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, right. And I don't think they changed dramatically the situation. As far as I understand, on the one hand, there is an interest from the Israeli and the Egyptians to consolidate this connection. But at the same time, there are other issues at stake, and perhaps Nimrod would like to elaborate because he dealt with that, I think, much more than me. Let me just add that with relation to Turkey, the bottom line is that whether it's the ideological or the realist considerations that guide Erdogan. And I think that along the years, we saw many changes. And the bottom line is that it was mainly the realist consideration that guided him. I think that we have forgotten, but he mediated between Israel and Syria back in 2007 and 2008 with Olmert as prime minister. We forget that during the whole crisis, the whole period of crisis between Israel and Turkey, the amount of trade between the two countries was between $4 and $6 billion annually. So, I mean, that sounds that we leave aside ideological issues and we do whatever is best for Turkey. Look, by the way, what is going on between Turkey and the Emirates. I mean, if we look regionally at the changes that are taking place, so it means that Turkey and Erdogan understood that Turkey is quite isolated in the Middle East, and therefore he's looking for new allies. Look what's happening between Turkey and Egypt. I mean, there was impasse between the two countries for many, many years as a result of the Turkey's, they supported the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt after the Arab Spring. So Egypt, Israel, the United Arab Emirates, that's a complete reversal of Turkey's position in the Middle East.
What about energy? Oh, okay, let me broaden the question. The Ukraine war affects a lot of things. For example, energy is just one that people mention a lot, but also food supply. Some of the natural resources cannot be shipped out, for example. And so there are consequences. And your part of the world, I was speaking to the Egyptian Consul General in Hong Kong, and that is, you know, how serious the wheat not being shipped to Egypt. How it's serious stuff. So what do you see are the biggest consequences of the Ukraine-Russian war that may hit you from the left field, that you don't expect that, but bingo, suddenly it hit you? Are there anything that we should be watching out for? Moran?
Yes, I think it's a very important question because this is the #1 reason for Biden's visit in the Middle East today. The energy crisis, the crisis in general in the world of the prices are going up. I think he finds a solution in the Gulf countries. And until now, the United States or Biden's administration, let's say, to be more accurate, refrained from approaching or from engaging with the Gulf countries from ideological reasons or others. But now the Biden administration understands the importance of the region, is it trying to, let's say, reconstruct relations between America and the Gulf countries. And this is making a lot of, I think, changes in the region.
Another question on the positive side. Where do you see are the business opportunities between Israel on the one hand and your neighbors, whether they have signed the Abraham Accord or not yet? Where are the biggest business opportunities? Because my friends are basically the fund managers, that are investing rather than businesses. Perhaps I just don't know enough of the business community in Israel. Where are the opportunities business-wise?
Between Israel and
your neighbor, UAE, Saudi Arabia.
So
Egypt.
I can say I can mention the Israel-UAE relations and the economic ties. And here we see the economics go to knowledge economics. I mean, the UAE is a country that wants to develop technology and develop modernism in its own territory. It doesn't want to import the end technology. It wants to develop, and this is where Israel can contribute in its R&Ds, research and development centers, And this is the kind of economic collaborations we see today between the countries.
May I add?
Yeah, go ahead. Ale?
First of all, about the economic situation, I think it's very important to remember that the situation in the Middle East in general, and particularly in the Arab countries, especially those who underwent the Arab Spring, is much worse because we are talking about the ramification, the economic ramification of the Arab Spring. Then came the Corona, and then the Ukrainian crisis. So we're talking about one after the other. Obviously, there is a big difference between the rich oil countries and the poor Arab countries, which to a large extent, they rely on the support of those countries. For example, Egypt and Sudan and Syria and Jordan, all of them, they need foreign support. Some of them, they do receive it from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries because they earned large amounts of money as a result of the rise of the oil prices. So there is a big difference in what's going on in the Arab world between the haves and the haves not. So that's one point. And in terms of business opportunities, if we go backward between before the Abraham Accord, then Israel's biggest market was, as I mentioned before, Turkey. The second one is the PA, the Palestinian Authority, something like $3.5 billion annually. And the Palestinians, to a large extent, they rely on the Israeli market. And that is still the situation. And the third one was the Gulf market, which was, we didn't know exactly the numbers, but let's say around the 1 billion. That's before the Abraham Accord. No doubt, the situation now is changing dramatically, especially with the United Arab Emirates. And we heard the numbers at the beginning of the session. And I do believe that another big opportunity is Saudi Arabia with the Vision 2030, with the building of the Neom City. And in my mind, behind the scenes, Israeli private companies are competing with different names, third companies and so on, but they are very much there trying somehow to, to use this opportunity in order to advance their interests. So yeah, in the Gulf, there are a lot of opportunities.
I have a proposal for everybody. For the two islands, turn it into a resort, either the Israeli or the Israeli joint venture with China. China has big construction companies who do the building. It will be owned by the Saudis, and the Chinese tourists will go there and enjoy themselves. And you can swim in the Red Sea. But let me go back to a more serious issue that we have not yet touched upon, and that is a lot of my Israeli friends are concerned, and my UAE friends are concerned that the United States is really retreating from the Middle East. And like it or not, it is just a fact. You may not like to admit it, but it is just a fact. So that is going to fundamentally change things in your part of the world. First of all, what do you think are the major changes as the United States retreat? As Moran said earlier, the most critical is Israel of all the countries. So can you address that issue about America's retreating from the Middle East? Imran?
Yeah, I can relate to that. And I would say that from an Israeli perspective, it looks a bit different. Yes, we know that the American foreign policy is changing, and the priorities are changing, and the global outlook is different. But when you look at the key Middle Eastern issues that are of interest to Israel, you see a lot of American capital invested in diplomatic efforts. If you look at the Iran issue, the US is highly invested over there. You see Israel-Lebanon relation, the ones who are mediating back and forth is the Americans. Amos Hochstein going to Beirut, going to Jerusalem, conveying messages, investing for a long period of time in trying to resolve the maritime border. When you look at the Eastern Mediterranean alliances that Israel has, the Americans are there. They want to be part of the Israel-Greece Cypriot alliance, and they are present at the meetings. They want to be part of the East Med Gas Forum. When there were tensions between Israelis and the Palestinians, the only international actor that managed to effectively reduce tensions and reach a ceasefire was the Americans together with the Egyptians. So I would say that from an Israeli perspective, first, it's very important to have the Americans involved in the region, and Israel's foreign policy prioritize keeping the Americans involved. But the changes that other countries may see, I think we do not feel them in that intensity just yet.
Ali?
May I add a sentence? As a process, I fully agree. What we are witnessing is American retreat from the Middle East. However, and I think this is very important to mention at the same time that the Americans are very much still here. The two biggest bases are one in Qatar and one in Bahrain, and they are very much operating. So I think that in such a way, when we are talking about the retreating Americans, we are forgetting that at the same time they are still here. The question is to what extent they are willing to engage, and certainly militarily. They do not. And that's where and how is Israel emerging as a possible ally. I think that one of the reasons for what we are witnessing between Israel and the Gulf, and particularly with Saudi Arabia, is a result of this retreat. The fact that Saudi Arabia, Gulf countries, perhaps Jordan and Egypt and Morocco as well, they understand that they need to rely on the local forces, on the local power. And Israel is one of them, maybe the most important one. But I think that it is very important to remember that America is very much there behind the scenes and behind connecting everyone. America was the one who moved Israel from the European command to the Middle East command. That was under the Trump administration. And that was a very important change because that allowed Israel to become a member in this new architecture, security architecture that we are witnessing today. So in such a way, Israel is benefiting from the new situation, but at the same time, Americans are still here to some extent.
Well, yeah, Moran, go ahead.
Yeah, it's important, Tisha, so I want to give my own perspective on that as well. I think that the question is proactiveness of the United States, proactiveness and motivation. And each administration has its own motivation in regards to the Middle East. I think that there are two outcomes to this, what you refer to retreating approach of the United States. One is, as I mentioned in the earlier discussion, is sort of an arms race we start seeing in the region. And this, I speak about it very, this is something that we should be very concerned when speaking about it, but we see a lot of arms purchases and we should look at it, I think, in focus. And the second outcome is the diversification that we see when countries are diversing their trade partners, even in security purchases. And this is one of the reasons for the Abraham Accords. And this is one of the reasons why the United Arab Emirates chose Israel as a regional ally, because the global allies are becoming less and less evident in the Gulf. And when we speak about how much the United States is involved in the region, let's just look when about the summer 2019, when the Gulf states were under attack, and the United States, even under Trump administration, didn't offer a solution for the refineries in Saudi Arabia that were smoking fire and were under attack. So no one helped them in this situation, and this is causing, there are many consequences to that here in the Gulf.
Well, let me suggest a thought in response to what Nimrod and Ali have said earlier, and that is America has historically, the businesses have been everywhere in the world, perhaps less so in Africa, but almost everywhere else in the world. And that's historic. Are they putting new money into it? That's one thought. The second one is what happened when the businesses no longer have politics, in particular America's political support, because of the isolationism politically So what will happen to the business people who are still want globalization while the politics is deglobalizing? That is something that I think we all should be very concerned about, in particular in your region. So let me devote the remaining couple of minutes to to another country, and that is Russia. What is Russia after in the Middle East? Why are they interested? Historically, they have been the last couple of decades. Even during the Obama administration, for example, in Syria, they've been in and out of Syria. So, what do you think is what do you think is Russia's longer-term intention in your part of the world?
I'm willing to relate to that.
Please.
I think that if I say it quite simple, maybe some would say it's more complicated than that, but I think that the Russians, they want to regain their position in the Middle East, simply put. We have to remember that Russia in the Middle East, I mean, during the Cold War, was a major player. It was playing a role, I mean, they had various partners in the Middle East, in Libya, in Iraq, in Syria, and Egypt, to a large extent, until the 70s, when they changed guards and they moved to the American position, and in other places as well. Now, looking backward, they lost most of their allies in the Middle East, and the Arab Spring in Syria gave them the opportunity to regain their position there. And they did establish their connection there with a port and with an airport that they use to their advantage. And Syria sometimes is underestimated how much Syria is important in terms of geostrategic location. It's in the middle, in the hub of the Middle East, and therefore, as Patrick Seal used to say, anyone who controls Syria, he exaggerated, of course, he said, is controlling the Middle East. That was an exaggeration, but still what he meant is Syria is very important. And they regained their position. Now, they are very much involved in Libya as well. I mean, this is not maybe a known story, but they somehow are playing a very important role as well there. And they are beginning also to try and influence other places as well. So this is the bigger picture, part of the trying to reach some kind of, if not hegemony, then a leading position in the international system.
Nimrod?
Yeah, I think it would be important to look at the Israeli perception of Russia, beyond the Russian interests, how Israel perceives Russia. And over the last few years, I think there was an understanding or a belief in Israel that Russia is a very strong actor when it comes to the Middle East. And that belief is now have been impacting the Israeli positions regarding the war in Ukraine, because over the last few months, especially during the first 2 months since the Russian invasion in Ukraine, you saw a gap between different members of the coalition about how to relate to that, right? Almost everybody was reiterating support for Ukraine's territorial sovereignty. The prime minister coming from the right-wing party Yamina, Naftali Bennett, was not mentioning Russia by name. Yair Lapid, on the other side, was very clear in his criticism of Russia. So it relates again to the issue of interests and values that we spoke about before when we talked about Turkey, but it also means that Israel now recalculates what it may or may not lose or gain when it takes a position on an international issue that Russia is involved with. At the beginning, the concern was that alienating Russia will limit Israel's freedom of action in Syria, which is a key security interest of Israel. Now I think more and more people in Israel are saying that's a price we are willing to pay because we need to be on the right side of history, because we need to align with our values, because we need to portray a very clear voice supporting Ukraine and criticizing what Russia is doing in line with what our international allies are doing. And the coming to power of Yair Lapid as prime minister, even if for a limited time, I think will give that position momentum, and we will see less consideration in Israeli policymaking about giving the reaction of Russia to be the key priority, or one of the key priorities in shaping the Israeli policies on Ukraine and elsewhere.
I will invite anyone, if you have any question, please, this is the last opportunity from the floor sitting here in front of me. If not, then I will ask the three speakers to each take 30 seconds to 60 seconds to say any last closing remarks that you want to say. Andrew? Yeah.
It's a little off topic, but it was part of my cocktail discussion before tonight. Israelis are famous for their weapons manufacturing. Are they players in the Ukraine-Russia war? In which sides, and where are their weapons deployed in the battlefield, and how are they performing?
Anyone want to take that one, or you want to ditch it?
I think officially it's not supporting providing weaponry, and I don't know any information about individual people doing so. I think Israel wants perhaps to change its image and to be able to export issues relating to energy and social change and positive things, and not to be an arms suppliers for conflicts of others. Interestingly enough, Naftali Bennett offered to mediate in the war in Ukraine. It was the first time I think that Israel made such an offer. And that's what I would like to see Israeli diplomacy focusing on, resolving conflicts, not nurturing them or supplying military equipment to one of the sides.
Okay, now let's take the reverse order, starting with Moran and Ali and then Nimrod. 30 to 60 second of final thoughts that you may like to share. Moran?
Thank you. Yes, I want to conclude by saying that what we see today, I think, is the countries of the region trying to set their own faith, becoming less and less dependent on global actors and more dependent on regional actors. And that is my explanation to the pacification era, as I call it, in the region. And thank you for the floor.
Thank you, Moran. Ali?
Yeah, just to relate to what is going on, Biden is coming to Israel and Saudi Arabia, and what we are going to see are some improvement or changes in the normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. But still, I'm very cautious, but we are not going to see a breakthrough, the establishment of diplomatic relations. This will wait until maybe a progress in the Israeli-Palestinian issue. But the future of the Abraham Accord relies to a large extent on what will happen between Israel and Saudi Arabia.
Nimrod, you may also want to address, I'll give you another 30 seconds for that. What is Biden's trying to achieve for his trip to the Middle East?
I think in terms of Israel, it's about really looking for a way to move forward, even a bit, the Israeli-Saudi relationship, and there may be a statement or a policy move dealing with that. Of course, the Iranian issue, the consequences of Ukraine, and the energy topics will be on the agenda. But just want to conclude by saying that as we speak about further normalization and relation with countries in different regions, basically the key foreign policy security issue that Israel needs to deal with is the relationship with our Palestinian neighbors. That impacts our daily life, that will impact our identity as a society, as a country, our democracy, our ability to live in peace, in full recognition and normalization with our partners and neighbors. And I think that should be a priority. Israel should move towards a two-state solution. It should invite different international actors to help it in the way, and it should look for whatever way possible to engage with the Palestinian leadership and look for a way forward on that. And thank you again for having us.
Thank you, Nimrod. Well, I think we better call it quit. Thanks everybody for joining, in particular those who are here physically, as well as I don't know how many, maybe 100, 200, 300 that are online joining us. I thank you as well. But last of all, but not least, I want to thank the three ladies and gentlemen from Israel who gave us a very good view of what's happening in your part of the world. In my lifetime, and I'm older than every one of you here, the Middle East has always been the most troubled part of the world. And I worry that in the coming years and decades, it may remain as the most difficult part of the world. And I can only say that I wish that part of the world peace, because without which I think the mankind is doomed. So thank you very much for joining us. Look forward to your physical visit one of these days. When you do come to Hong Kong, be sure to visit A Society. You're always welcome. Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you, Ronnie.